For years, a question festered, a silent poison at the heart of the crown's greatest spectacle. Why was Meghan Markle's bloodline almost entirely erased from the day she walked down the aisle? The cameras framed it. The palace guard felt the chill of it. The global press corps rode around it. But the truth remained locked, an unspeakable secret, especially to the man who swore to protect her, Prince Harry. Until now. Because, according to a leak from his most trusted inner circle, Harry has finally shattered the code of silence concerning those abandoned seats. Not through the calculated firestorm of a televised confession, but in the white-knuckle, late-night outbursts he shared with those bound by absolute loyalty. He allegedly confessed the dynamic was less a feud and more a brutal, enforced exile, hinting that the force that kept Meghan's kin at bay wasn't mere tabloid chaos, wasn't logistical failure, but a catastrophic, political liability, a ghost from her past whose true terror he didn't comprehend until the silk of her wedding gown was already being sewn. And every evasive answer, every panicked denial, every missing face points to the same chilling epicenter, a single, deliberate deletion from Meghan's lineage. That's where the countdown begins. Long before Meghan was elevated to the highest echelon of the establishment, there was a flaw concealed within her ancestry. A defect insignificant enough to be ignored, yet volatile enough to trigger the collapse of an institution. When Meghan and Harry's engagement was confirmed, the Crown's unofficial chroniclers followed precedent and released the complete, sanitized bloodline of the future Duchess. Line after line was perfectly engraved, detailing birthright, dates of passage, origins, the monarchies. Demands for stability and unquestioned pedigree on full, intimidating display. But precisely where Doria Ragland's mother's name should have been anchored, there was only a vacuum. A terrifying, deliberate ellipsis, a black hole on a document that, by design, leaves no stone unturned. For the casual observer, it was a clerical misstep. But to the palace's shadows, the vetted archivists, and the genealogists who served the crown, the omission was a declaration of war. A matriarch's identity is the bedrock of any history. Its absence is not an accident. It is a terrifying manifesto. And the message was crystalline. A power player had ordered that name to be executed. This void was not random. It was surgically precise. According to classified files, the erasure recurred across sensitive documents, different agencies, and varied formats, each time stonewalling the single explosive inquiry. Who is Doria's mother? How had the apparatus of the state failed for 70 years to pin down a single name? And what catastrophic liability was so deeply entombed that maintaining a fiction was safer than excavating the truth? Because as the deep dive intensified, the empty line mutated from a cipher into an omen. A prophecy that the truth shielded by that absent identity would eventually tear its way through the palace gates and right into the epicenter of the most watched wedding in modern history. Windsor Castle, May 2018. The world devoured the image of Meghan Markle ascending the aisle, a glittering beacon of progressive monarchy. But while the global mind was captivated by the sheer spectacle, a far more chilling reality was unfolding just feet from the altar. On the bride's side of the chapel, a vast, echoing quadrant was left strategically vacant. And amid that funerary silence sat one woman, Doria Ragland. No human shield of siblings beside her, no protective layers of cousins behind her, not even a mercenary relative to disguise the isolation. Just Doria, suspended alone, positioned in direct, terrifying contrast to Queen Elizabeth II. Her singular presence was a gut punch. It wasn't organic. It wasn't respectful. It was a terrifying ultimatum. The palace establishment felt the seismic shift instantly. Insiders confirmed that even the Queen was visibly chilled by the unsettling symmetry. A royal merger is meant to project permanence, seamless integration, and the powerful union of dynasties. But here, half the historical narrative was a black hole. It screamed the unmentionable question everyone registered, yet no one dared to voice. Where was Meghan's family truly? Because ceremonies of this magnitude, especially royal ones, are acts of total control. Every single chair, every whispered conversation, every guest is vetted and placed with tyrannical intent. And the notion that an entire half of the bride's ancestral line would be evaporated from her most defining moment, that doesn't happen by oversight. According to officials familiar with the war room planning, the decision was not convenient. It was not a spat. It was an execution. A cold, surgical choice driven by absolute terror. That too much exposure, too many faces, too many unscripted moments over stolen whiskey might detonate a secret buried deep beneath the Markle surname. A secret tied directly to that unnerving blank space on the genealogical schematic. This is the moment the facade collapses. 8 months after the vows, when the media frenzy had subsided and the fairy tale was a fragile memory, the missing identity clawed its way to the surface. Doria Raglan's mother, the figure shielded by decades of redacted files, was covertly identified in public records as Janet Arnold, born September 4th, 1929, in the haunted city of Sandusky, Ohio, dead December 27th, 2000, age 71. On the surface, it appeared like a bureaucratic ghost finally laid to rest. A missing gear finally ground into place. But names carry lethal gravity. And once private researchers possessed the name, the locks began to fall away. Death certificates, hidden ledgers, forgotten deeds, municipal records. A tidal wave of historical documents suddenly illuminated Janet's entire existence. Her parents, her lineage, entire generations of people who had been deliberately invisible until this hour. But instead of a clean, linear history, the new intelligence instantly fractured the narrative. Because the details didn't just fail to reconcile. Dates violently overlapped. Identities fused in impossible configurations. The deeper the forensic team followed the root structure, the more grotesquely entwined the whole thing became. And the chilling truth dawned. The reason Janet Arnold's identity was obliterated wasn't her lack of existence, but because speaking her name aloud unleashed a malignant pattern of lineage that forces had spent years burying alive. With Janet's identity confirmed, the focus narrowed onto the creators of the secret, her parents. And this is the point where the narrative hemorrhages, crossing the line from deep state mystery to something utterly profane. Janet's father was logged as James T. Arnold, born July 18, 1909, eliminated in 1939, just 30 years old. Her mother was inscribed as Natalie May Allen, whispered as Nettie. May, born June 23, 1897, a South Carolina refugee, survived into her 80s, interred in Englewood Park Cemetery, Los Angeles. 2 parents, 2 distinct streams, superficially, a commonplace ancestry. But the state's memory didn't terminate there. The records yielded the names of their parents, and that's when the entire architecture of the bloodline violently imploded under the sheer weight of its own contradiction. Nettie May's mother was documented as Gertrude Elizabeth Sadler. Nothing jarring until the researchers pivoted to James T. Arnold's side. James' mother was also listed as Gertrude Elizabeth Sadler. The identical woman, the identical birth cipher, the identical evidentiary proof, one single grandmother, governing 2 ostensibly separate parental trajectories. A family tree that did not grow outward, it cannibalized itself. When mapped by the analysts, the structure screamed its meaning. Janet Arnold's mother and father shared the same matriarch. The 2 biological sources of her life were half-siblings, the kind of genetic nexus historically anathematized across every religious and legal doctrine, even in epochs where consanguineous unions were overlooked. This was not a rumor, not diluted, not ambiguous. This was a direct, genetic knot. And instantly, the decades of suffocating silence made visceral sense. The blank field was not incompetence. The erasure was not an error. It was either a defensive shield or a strategic concealment, depending on who owned the weapon. Because ratifying Janet's parentage meant unleashing a primordial scandal that could poison entire generations. And in the paranoid world of royal vetting, this revelation is not inconvenient. It is a biological threat assessment. Once the terrifying findings regarding Janet Arnold's origin reached the absolute apex of the palace's covert operations, the posture allegedly shifted from guarded curiosity to full-scale emergency containment. According to high-level assets familiar with the internal blood work protocols, Meghan's lineage was subjected to the same ruthless analytical scrutiny applied to any royal entrant. But this time, the genealogical discoveries didn't merely provoke alarm. They sounded the death knell. Behind soundproofed doors, the Crown's top legal strategists allegedly delivered the grim implications to Harry. Stripped of sensationalism, devoid of emotion, just the cold, hard data. A vital branch of Meghan's maternal line pointed toward a documented, alleged incestuous union, not distant, not speculative, but glaringly evident through the overlapping parentage in the official state records. The central fear wasn't merely public humiliation or a media circus. It was the future legacy, the terrifying optics, the predictable public revulsion, and the high-stakes biological risk assessments that sources confirm were quietly commissioned as theoretical concerns regarding potential issue. Not as moral judgment, but as necessary context. Every ruling power fears the headline that can strip its authority naked. And this was the kind of earth-shattering revelation that could collapse the global monarchy. So, a strategy was forged in the deepest shadow. Here is the final rewrite chunk, maintaining the exact same length while bringing the narrative to a suspenseful, high-stakes conclusion. Execute the deletion of Janet's parentage from all archive charts. Her identity could be permitted, but not the sinister origins. Enforce absolute prohibition on public reference to Doria's entire extended network. The fewer contacts exposed to the lens, the fewer breach points for intelligence leaks. Implement ruthless control over the wedding attendance ledger. A contained radius guaranteed a contained, falsified narrative. Protect the Crown from a biohazard disclosure. Not from any personal vendetta against Meghan, but from the existential terror embedded in her bloodline. This was not a clash of wills. It was a cold-blooded, organizational surgery executed with chilling royal precision. And at the nexus of the whole operation sat a single, damning calculation. The monarchy preferred a vacant, screaming void to an unvetted human vulnerability. With the palace's silent war machine deployed, the burden of managing this ticking clock fell entirely onto Meghan and Doria. Their public choreography has always felt like a controlled detonation, intentional, selective, never comfortable, always hyper-measured, as if they navigate the globe under the crushing mandate that opacity is the only guarantee of survival. Doria surfaces only for brief, brutally manicured appearances, a staged arrival, a pre-approved documentary clip, a quick, sterile visit, and then she vanishes again, retreating into the fortress of solitude she has maintained for decades. No mother accepts this level of imposed distance when her child marries into the most powerful, scrutinized family on earth. But for Doria, silence was both her armor and her fatalistic survival mechanism. Sources monitoring Meghan's engagement with her estranged American relatives confirm the same lethal blueprint. Isolation, absolute paranoia, and a rigid refusal to re-engage with the wider tribal network. This isn't just distaste, it's strategic obliteration. As if reactivating those connections risks triggering the very history that was incinerated along with them. The alleged revelations surrounding Janet Arnold's origins cast an irreparable pall. Not because Meghan or Doria authored the violation, they are merely inheritors, but because that lineage carries a terminal gravity. The kind that warps behavior in subtle, enduring ways. A mother's perpetual retreat. A daughter's impenetrable walls. A family held in a state of suspended animation. It all conforms to the same unwritten law. Some truths are too toxic to be carried in the light, so they must be entombed in the dark. And when the cameras framed Doria Ragland, a solitary sentinel in Windsor, that terrifying silence became its own confession. When the global feed panned across St. George's Chapel that day, the world ingested a sophisticated lie, a love story, a modern era, a fresh start for the Crown. But hidden in the geometry of the shot was the detail that screamed the truth. Not the dress, not the ancient vows, but the empty, accusing seats directly behind Doria Ragland. A silent, perfectly aligned column of non-existence that harbored more evidence than any authorized statement ever would. Because the absence wasn't merely a physical oversight. It was generational contagion. It stretched backward through Janet Arnold, through the ghost of James, through the hardened Nettie May, back to a grandmother whose name was duplicated on a sacred document. It stretched through every file where the maternal line was surgically excised, through every chart published with a chilling gap, through every low-frequency warning among advisors about what could never be allowed to breach containment. And when Harry finally broke his silence, quietly, guardedly, about the true terror behind the missing family, he didn't describe drama, petty conflict, or passive estrangement. He described a lethal complication, a national security pressure, an ancient history he was still, because the blank space wasn't just a vanished name. It was an unhealed, open generational wound, one that had been passed down in silence, hidden by survival instincts. The palace could manage the photography. They could destroy the paper trail. They could manually edit the seating chart and redact names from state papers. But they could not unwrite the crime committed decades before Meghan Markle was even conceived. That catastrophic shadow followed her into the gilded cage of royalty. A hidden, toxic chapter of her lineage, a story buried for the sake of geopolitical stability, not shame. A truth protected because exposing it would cause a civilizational collapse more profound than hiding it ever could. And so we conclude where the story began, with a blank space on a genealogy chart that was never truly blank. A void that held the crushing gravity of a century. A void that mutilated a royal wedding. A void that defined a family's silent penance. And a void that leaves us with one final, haunting question. If this single, devastating secret survived nearly a lifetime of intense scrutiny, what unthinkable atrocities still wait, buried in the pages of this story the world has not yet been allowed to read?